Everything begins somewhere. Everything has a once upon a time. So join me as we take a look at some of the milestones in the establishment of parliamentary democracy in the islands of Trinidad and Tobago. Milestones to parliamentary democracy in Trinidad and Tobago. From Spain they came, 1498 to 1797. You appear to have had a very long journey, senor.
Too long. So many challenges. But I'm closer to that which I seek. Is this El Dorado?
No. This land is called Aire.
Well, I call this land La Trinité, in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain.
We all know that Trinidad was located by Italian sailor Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus, on his third voyage to this region in 1498. He had a mandate, of course: bring wealth back to Spain. After all, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had invested in his vision. But Trinidad wasn't overflowing with riches as Columbus and the Spanish settlers had assumed. In their perception, it also lacked an established, productive peasantry for Spanish settlers to exploit. So, for almost 100 years, the island was ignored because there appeared to be no reason to commit further resources from Spain without having tons of precious metals shipped in return. In 1592, this changed. Antonio de Berrio y Orunha, the Spanish-appointed governor of Trinidad, instructed his lieutenant, Domingo de Vera, to formally establish the city of San Jose de Orunha in 1592. San Jose, or St. Joseph, was then recognized as the center of Spanish governance in Trinidad until 1784. This first form of known government comprised a cabildo, or municipal council, shared by the governor, 6 elected regidores, or councillors, and 2 elected alcaldes ordinarios, or municipal magistrates. In 1593, Antonio de Berrio assumed his governorship and settled in the city of St. Joseph, which became the first capital of Trinidad. Now, the governor represented the Spanish crown, and the cabildo was made up of Spanish settlers. This cabildo was an elective body, but due to the scarcity of white Spanish males, the posts were held for life. These influential officials were put in charge of all aspects of local government. They also elected the regidores, or councillors, who elected the alcaldes, or magistrates. Thus, Trinidad had its first localized system of government, which would continue for 2 centuries. Hi, Governor Don Pedro de la Moneda. I see you're going on a trip.
I am leaving San Jose de la Orunha. This place is filthy. It is impoverished. I cannot live under these conditions any longer. I am moving to Puerto de España.
Well, in that case, let me not delay you any further. God save His Majesty in Spain.
Yes. The sovereign leader.
Governor Pedro de la Moneda had a lot to be angry about. Over the period 1593 to 1757, the Spanish-appointed governors in Trinidad had several difficult tasks: controlling the indigenous peoples, instituting an encomienda system to distribute land and labor to settlers, ensuring the conversion of the Indians to Christianity through the establishment of missions, and quelling the ambitions of the Cabildo, which at one point resulted in a revolt and imprisonment of the governor.
But there were a large number of other First Nations that resented this Spanish control. because first of all, they were not accustomed to working like slaves in this way. They were doing their own work, cultivating cassava, cultivating peas, doing a lot of fishing and hunting and having a very free life. Now all of a sudden, in the encomiendas, they are restricted. They are no longer traveling, peripatetic. They become sedentary, so they resent that. They also strongly resented the Capuchin missionaries who were continuously telling them about how worthless, how useless their many deities were. And these deities revolved around sun and moon and earth and so on. And the Capuchins never lost an opportunity for degrading, imprisoning, sometimes beheading the shamans. The shamans were the priests. So that there was a good deal of resentment from both angles, the religious and the economic. And so the history of Spanish and Amerindian contact in Trinidad is a history of continuous revolt.
In the 16th century, the population had retreated to the missions, Naparima, Savaneta, Arena, Tacarigua, Cora, and Montserrat. These missions also had cabildos, which were subordinate to the cabildo in St. Joseph. They were ruled by male native Indians, but subject to the control of the missionaries and churches.
Well, it ended very tragically, very sadly for these various First Nations, who, as I said, are very proud people for their own culture, for their own civilization, for their own means of production. This constant barrage of Spanish oppression caused a large number of these Indians to run from Tagarigua and Aruca and Sabaneta further back into the forest. So instead of moving forward in civilization, they went backwards. And then there's a constant resistance on the part of the Indians, those who could resist, those who remained in the larger centers of habitation. And there was also the fact that the Spaniards were increasingly became less and less interested in Trinidad as they were opening up the mines of Mexico and Peru and other areas of Central America. And these precious metals that they got from those areas are far more valuable than cultivating cocoa or coffee or such things in Trinidad. So as a result of the combination of these various factors, Spanish getting increasingly dissatisfied, having continuously to suppress Amerindian revolt, Amerindians themselves becoming less and less because of the diseases and so on. So all of these factors made the Spanish have less and less interest, increasingly less and less interest in developing Trinidad anymore.
The Indian population was declining. The settlers were poverty-stricken and bordering on rebellion. As had occurred in the past, Spain was ignoring Trinidad. From the early 16th century, the island fell under the supervision of the Viceroy in Bogota, Colombia. And it wasn't until 1777 that it was brought under the jurisdiction of the Captain General of Venezuela.
One of the most outstanding dramatic incidents as a result of Spain's neglect stemmed from the level of autonomy that developed among the Spanish settlers. The Cabildo, which was one of the main arms of the local government in Trinidad, in 1743, revolted against the governor. Now, that kind of revolt is quite as a result of the level of autonomy that had developed. They had actually challenged the authority of the governor, particularly for him appointing someone to act in his position while he went on leave. In the view of the Cabildo, the only body that were given that authority to act in the capacity of the governor would have been the Cabildo or the magistrates they appointed. But the governor did not do that. He did not wait for their consent and therefore appointed an acting governor. And he left the island in 1743. In 1745 he returned, and on his return the Cabildo actually imprisoned him because he thought he breached the law.
The Cabildo reacted by going on strike, held few meetings for the next 4 years, and petitioned the king to recall the rebels as there were few intelligent settlers to run the city. In 1751, they succeeded in having the Banishment Revolt. Neither side forgot this. In 1757, Governor Pedro de la Moneda gave up in disgust with the poor and unsanitary conditions in the city. The settlers, in fact, could not meet his demands to improve the city as they were financially handicapped. San Jose, or St. Joseph, continued to deteriorate until in 1784, the Cabildo moved to Port of Spain. Since the early 17th century, Port of Spain existed as a fishing village and a port of call for ships trading in tobacco. In 1757, it had two streets, Duncan and Nelson Streets, with a population of 300 to 400, comprising Spaniards, colored peoples, foreign settlers, traders, fishermen, rum distillers, even farmers. After 1783, trade increased rapidly and the village was transformed into a bustling commercial town. By 1784, Port of Spain had become the new capital of Trinidad and the Cabildo had relocated here. Spain's interest in Trinidad was reawakened. It saw the possibility of a prosperous colony and began to invite foreigners to settle.
Right. Well, by the 1770s, the Spanish government had recognized that Spain really didn't have the resources to develop Trinidad into a flourishing plantation economy, such as Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique had been for a long time. So they took the difficult decision to allow foreign immigrants into Trinidad. Specifically, they were hoping to attract French Roman Catholic planters. There was an early cedula, which means decree, in 1777. It didn't have much impact. And then negotiations began for a much wider kind of piece of legislation. The result was the Cedula of Population, which was issued by the Spanish king, Carlos III, in 1783. What it basically did was offer generous incentives to foreign settlers who had to be Roman Catholic and had to be nationals of states which were in alliance with Spain. And of course, both those criteria pointed to French settlers. Economically, it meant that Trinidad became a flourishing plantation economy, producing cotton, coffee, sugar for export, so that the island picked up economically and commercially. Socially and demographically, it meant that the French and free-colored people became the main elite groups, free groups, and enslaved Africans became the major population group. So by the time the British arrived in 1797, enslaved Africans were already over 50% of the total population. Culturally, it meant the introduction of the French language and the introduction of Creole, patois. And patois did in fact become the majority language in Trinidad in the 19th century. It meant the introduction of aspects of French culture and what we often call French African Creole culture, including carnival, including the language, Creole, patois, and including a world of folklore and folk tales and folk culture, which we often call an African-French Creole fusion or mixture.
From here on in, Trinidad began to assume its multicultural look and composition. In addition to the French, the cedula of population attracted some Irish and a few English planters. The old Spanish and Indian populations, who were centered mainly in St. Joseph and the Indian villages, were now outnumbered by a new, larger French and African settlers. In 1777, there were about 632 persons residing in Port of Spain, but 2 years later it accounted for 4,525 people, consisting of 938 whites, 1,671 free coloreds and blacks, and 1,916 slaves. The total population of Trinidad by 1797 had reached 17,718, of which 56.4% were slaves. By contrast, in that same year, the Indians numbered only 1,082, or 6% of the total population. Also significant was the total of 4,467 free coloreds and free blacks as against 2,151 whites. The whites were outnumbered, not only by the slaves, but also by the free coloreds, some of whom were themselves planters and slave owners. Trinidad now had a productive base, new prosperity, and was at the center of the West Indian plantation system. This is Shakur Street, named after Trinidad's last Spanish governor, Don Jose Maria Shakur. Among other things, he goes down in history as having reformed the administration of the island by moving its power structure, the Cabildo, to Port of Spain, and by assuming control of the rest of the island, effectively creating two distinct levels of government. Now, the influx of the French overpowered the number of Spaniards. Previously, in negotiating their migration to Trinidad, the cedula of population had granted the settlers Spanish citizenship and full privileges of office after 5 years. But this time had not elapsed, and the French were already in control of the Cabildo. Governor Shakur was governing a restless international colony. At first, he ruled with the assistance of 3 or 4 officials who were either from Spain or the neighboring continent, South America. They comprised an assessor, a fiscal, and 2 treasury officials. Together, they formed the Junta Provincial, or Provincial Council, which was subordinate to the Junta Superior in Caracas. With the revised population density, this system of government had to change.
Well, what happened under that period when the cellular population was implemented? You had Governor Shakur in power at that time. Eventually, by 1785, the commissioners of population, and they were divided in 3 segments really. Each commissioner had a different area of Trinidad that he was responsible for. So you had Trinidad being divided in the north, central, and east. Their powers went beyond the recording of details about the population that settled and maintaining roads, etc. In fact, the function expanded to the point of actually assisting in maintaining law and order, collecting details about agricultural production, and to assist the commissioners of population in these 3 districts. The districts were then further divided into 28 quarters under commandants who were normally landowners.
The multitude of French immigrants here meant the islands had more in common with the French West Indies than with the provinces under the Captaincy General in Venezuela, to which Trinidad still belonged. It also dragged the country into French ideological struggles, such as the French Revolution. In Europe, Britain emerged as the great enemy of the French Revolution. This sentiment filtered to the French West Indies. By 1796, Britain had crushed rebellions in Grenada and St. Vincent and recaptured St. Lucia. Guadeloupe remained in French hands. Hundreds more fled to Trinidad. However, with increased French refugees sympathetic to the revolution, it meant that the conflict had come to Trinidad. Governor Shakur was unable to prevent their entry, but he made his opposition to them and their principles known. Governor Shakur.
See?
These are trying times.
Indeed. The tides, they are turning.
I see you had to close down Trinidad's first newspaper, the Gazette.
It was published by one of those new settlers, but it had too much news about the revolution in France. I also wrote to Spain about my concerns. You see, I believe there is a high possibility that this revolution will spread to the slaves and the free coloreds here in Trinidad.
I see your point. Well, Good day to you, Don Chacon. I'll leave you to your musings. In October 1796, France convinced Spain to declare war on Britain. Chacon knew what the consequences would be. Trinidad was now exposed to British invasion.
Late in 1796, a decision was taken to send a very large British expeditionary force, naval and military, to the Caribbean to see which of the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean might be open to capture, put it that way. And Trinidad was first on the list, so a very large military naval operation under the leadership of Ralph Abercrombie, one of Britain's most distinguished soldiers of the day, arrived in Trinidad in February 1797. The Spanish governor, Jose Maria Chacon, had a weak garrison at his command. There was a Spanish fleet in the Gulf of Paria, but the admiral, recognizing that he couldn't possibly defeat the British Navy force, decided to destroy his own ships. The technical word is scuttle. So the Spanish admiral destroyed by fire his ships which were in the Gulf. And Chacon essentially decided to surrender without resisting. He recognized that he had no possible way of defeating this force. When the South American colonies of Spain became independent, one could foresee that Britain, as the leading commercial and industrial power in the world, would wish to penetrate the markets of those countries. And because of Trinidad's geographical position, it was seen as an entrepot, as a port which could be a transshipment spot for British goods to enter the South American market and for South American goods to be shipped via Trinidad to Britain and Europe. There were also geopolitical and strategic considerations. In the late 1790s, France was in the grips of her revolution, and there was a very aggressive republican regime in France with which Britain was at war. And there were very serious fears that Trinidad, a Spanish colony but weakly defended by Spain, might have fallen into the hands of the forces of Republican France. And Republican France was Britain's #1 enemy. So a preemptive strike to go into Trinidad and seize Trinidad was partly in order to ward off the possibility of Republican France taking that now valuable colony.
On February 18, 1797, the Articles of Capitulation were concluded in Valsaine, legally ending almost 300 years of Spanish rule over the island of Trinidad. In its place, a British sovereignty was established, which in its first 4 years after the conquest took the form of a military occupation. In 1801, the beginnings of constitutional government began. Trinidad, located by Columbus, ignored by the Spanish, exploited by the French, captured by the British. Trinidad, native home to Amerindians, colonized island to Europeans, land of enslavement for Africans. Trinidad, constantly evolving politically through historic occurrences. Join me again for Milestones to Parliamentary Democracy in Trinidad and Tobago.